So you kind of gravitated toward this Eastern model, or what's the
Yes.
big main differences there?
Growing up in Seattle, there was it was I was mostly doing youth ministry with kids from public schools, and it would be the rare child who was growing up in an intact family. So given not only how much divorce there was that I was experiencing, but just the amount, the percentage, and the impact that was having on kids, it made marriage and family feel like an experiment that had completely gone off the rails. And so I was seeing a lot of people just lose hope, cohabitate, look for alternative lifestyles. That was very normal. And because of the level of dysfunction that you see in that culture. And so then all of a sudden, and also probably the person least interested in family was the man. I mean, he was most of these fathers were the ones who were, just pulling away and abandoning their families at that time. So then I was in Israel and I saw such a contrast. I remember the day that it really struck me was I watched a whole group of dads pushing strollers with little kids in tow. And I'm like, that's really weird. Like, what are those guys thinking? Like, why would they be interested? Haven't they woken up to the fact that kids are annoying, that families, maybe more for women, all these kind of ideas that I think were sort of subconscious, but were a part of the conclusions that I was wrestling with because of just the total dysfunction I had seen in that culture. And so that contrast just sort of blew my mind. I was just like, what is it that, particularly that these men see, that causes them as fathers to be super interested in that? So and as I was meeting both Arab and Jewish fathers, it was so interesting how they would just want to talk about their family, talk about fatherhood, talk about their kids. And there was an engagement that I'd never seen before. And so I started to ask, where did you guys get this paradigm? Like, how do you see things differently? Particularly Jewish fathers who were familiar with West, and they would invariably all sort of note one major difference, in one single word: Abraham. Their idea of family was really, they derived sort of the first principles of family from their study of Abraham. And so they were an Abrahamic religion or an Abrahamic culture in that sense. So you hear those words about Muslim and Jewish cultures. You also hear it applied to Christianity, but I would say we're the least Abrahamic of the Abrahamic religions. We're the least likely to be influenced by Abraham in any way. Abraham's vision of hospitality, Abraham's vision of multi-generational family. So there's a lot of lessons there because most Christians just see, everything that they're learning about Abraham really through the lens of almost history. And there might be a theological gloss of like, well, Abraham's like the man of faith. But these cultures took Abraham's lifestyle seriously, his values seriously. And so on one hand, I could say, well, I don't feel like I have to do that as a Christian. Like I've not been raised that way. I don't, that hasn't been an influence in the theology that I've been learning. On the other hand, it's not as if we have got this figured out. Like there's something really, really wrong with the way that we're thinking about family. Could this potentially be a part of the reason that there's something that we've left behind in our decision to really not take seriously the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly what they're teaching about family? So I began to kind of go down this sort of rabbit hole of how would you think about family if you really, and how would you build a family in the modern Western world if you had the same values that Abraham had? And I began to, over the 5 or 10 years of my early marriage and fatherhood, began to adopt more and more of those values, and it totally shifted the way that I saw family.
Okay. So when I think of Abraham, I mean, I just don't think that there was a ton about his family, but I guess they're written. But, I do, when I think of hospitality, I know like I don't know, he entertained, like actually angels and God actually at one
That's
point
right.
it sounded
Yep.
like, but, so what are these like key pieces, I guess, like that's really interesting, like that you could bring this into like Western.
Yes.
What are you bringing into your family? I'm guessing that's where it started, but
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes it is lost a little bit because the Hebrew is so clear. So like Avram literally means exalted father. So when you're reading
Mhm.
it in Hebrew, you're reading every time you read Abraham, you're saying father, 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 father. And when Jesus referred to Abraham in the New Testament, he referred to him as Father Abraham. And this is the way
Mhm.
that these cultures think about Abraham. He's a meta father. He's really describing and showing you the way God interacts with the whole sort of conceptual category of fatherhood. In the same way, Adam, when you're reading that in Hebrew, it means man, right? And so if you
Mhm.
read man, 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 you're going to have a different theology. You're going to come out different lessons. You're going to see Adam is really living out an archetype of what humanity and men in particular struggle with, right? If you see it that way, Abraham is that, but for fatherhood, right? So he is really living out the archetype of how a father interacts with God and how God sees fatherhood. And you see that from the very, very beginning in Genesis 12, when we're introduced to Abraham. God says like very strange things to Abraham, like, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. And, he talks in every time, if you read the word you're going to be famous. He's talking about things that didn't actually happen during Abraham's lifetime. He's talking about his family line. In other words, like God interacts with Abraham's entire multi-generational family through the father. And this is kind of where the idea of the patriarch comes from. The idea that a father actually sets in motion an entire family line that has a particular relationship with God and interaction with who God is. And you see there's multiple other family lines throughout the Old Testament that also had a similar interaction, but Abraham is sort of the archetype of that. And so then you see Abraham's real interest in what does a father do? Well, the first thing is everything he's doing is as a father. He doesn't do work separately, or I mean, his whole life he lives out as a father. So when he's doing his work, it's in building his family. So we're introduced to his household in the next chapter. We're told that he has 318 trained men in his household. So like a big part of fatherhood, and you see this again through the Old Testament, and then the New Testament. The one thing that a father is told to do by Paul in Ephesians 6 is to train up your children, right? And so a huge part of fatherhood is training, training, training. So Abraham was constantly training his household. And then you see, the obsession Abraham had with his family line and the multi-generational nature of his family. So when he was struggling to have a baby, you see, this tension that emerges with him and Sarah, and him calling out to God in Genesis 17, like, I what can you give me, God? I don't even have a son. And God didn't rebuke him and say, how dare you think about that? Like, this is all about you and all about one. No, God was like, no, I will. There's going to be a son of promise, and then in Genesis 18, God, he actually in that scene where God comes down and it has all that hospitality that Abraham shows, then God says, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah? Because I chose him, because I knew he would train up his family. He would command his family in righteousness and justice. And so the whole reason God said I chose Abraham was because of the kind of father he was, right? And so there's so many lessons there. You see how he negotiated for land rights. You see in there, and again, it's not that Abraham's the perfect father, but there are elements of fatherhood, training and asset building, and how to set up your multi-generational family, and in terms of like the spiritual leadership of the family. All of that is there in this character, that you see is who's very much a human character, making mistakes and wrestling with God in various ways, but he's living that out. And so I just found it like a bottomless well of insight as I go deeper and deeper into how Abraham was as a father.
Man, I think you just tore that open for me. I never saw that. I knew his name meant like something about, well, the name change, right? Was
Right. Abraham
Abram.
Abraham means father of many nations.
Yeah.
Avram, which was his original name, means exalted father. Yeah.
Exalted Father. I never pictured him as that father figure. But and sometimes I focus on the mistakes that he made. It's like, geez, man, you made this like wild line
That's
by
right.
trying to do things in your own ability for God, like, and coming up with this idea like from the maybe the local culture did, where you take a servant woman as your wife to bear children. And anyways,
Yeah.
I focus on the mistakes, but there is a lot of good that like you brought out.
Yes.
He trained people. I always looked at it like, man, this guy. I look at like he had servants, and this is like he kind of had a business, right? Like because that's how you survived is you had people run the flocks and all aspects of what he had. He must have been wealthy, right? With to have that many just trained men, you know.
Right.
Um,
Yes. Well, that's
so
a huge part of it is he's building a household. And this is, I
mhm,
think, one of the things that's really confusing to modern Western people is that for thousands of years, what a father was somebody who built a household. And a household would include, employees and businesses, and there would be an economic engine in the household and inheritance and things passed on and training, and you'd be partnering with your adult children, and then so there's a lot, as an extended family and almost as a tribe or a clan. And so we've really, since the Industrial Revolution, abandoned that idea of the building of a household, and I think it's confused men greatly as to what fatherhood is. What is a father if he's not building a household? And often, what is a mother? I mean, Proverbs 31. If you read the archetypal mother or woman, woman of valor, mother of valor, matriarch, essentially, you read, the details of Proverbs 31, and virtually every detail is describing somebody who's managing a very complex household. And so we are really adrift at this point because we're experimenting with a totally different kind of idea of family. The kind of the nuclear family that we kind of lift up as the ideal that really existed for about 15 years from 1940 to 1955 after World War II. And then has started breaking down after that. We harken back to that as if that's sort of the traditional archetype, but that is not the way families have lived for thousands of years. And so we are really reeling from this, and we're so confused. Right now, the United States, we are the number one nation in the entire world in single parent households.
mm,
Of the over almost 200 nations on this planet, there is no nation in the world that has more single parent households than the United States. This wealthy nation that is saturated in Christian teaching and churches more than almost any other nation on the planet. And we have the most single parent households. Something has gone so terribly wrong. We do not, we've basically, I think the basic way to say it is it's like we have lost the blueprint for what a family is, and we don't know it. And so we keep building these things that don't last. They fracture very predictably and repeatedly. And instead of like saying, oh my gosh, I think we might have left something in the past, like let's go and do some archaeology and figure out what happened. Like where did we leave the blueprint? We just keep, pushing forward into the brave new world and experimenting on the next generation, some other new iteration of family design that is likely to make things worse.
that's how I would feel about what I'm seeing like that's going on currently, like in our public schools and like this agenda of like gender confusion. It's like this just kind of destroying people in their homes. I didn't realize how bad we were with single family or single parent homes. Yeah, that seems like the fruit of our belief is being played out, and it's not a good one. If you like that clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. If you want to watch the entire interview, click right here.